All right, Ayo, welcome to season 2, episode 9 of D.O.Ph. I'm not swearing today. I have a very, I see how many berries? Special guest with me today.
Too many
so I'll be on my best behavior. So today, my name is Damion, and we'll be joined by Girlhan.
Hi, good morning.
And we have, as I said, I have a very special guest with me today, and his name is Greg. Greg, you want to say something?
Well, yes. I first of all, I want to go on record as that I'm certainly not an expert on racism. I am doing this out of interest, and as a 67-year-old Maritimer, I'm not particularly woke or politically correct, so I hope I don't embarrass myself.
You will not embarrass yourself, and I will not allow that either. So there you go. Greg let the rabbit out of the hat. We're going to talk about racism today. As you can see, Greg is a white male, I'm a black male, and Girlhan is somewhere in between. So, and she don't want to be on camera. So please, the people who are coming to say, how come she talks and she's not on camera? Please don't come at me. She doesn't want to be on camera. So this is what we do. We practice liberation. She wants to be off camera, so we allow her to be off camera. That is liberation. Is that sexist or not? Can you speak, please? Go.
It's definitely not sexist.
Okay, thank you. There you go.
And to you, the viewer, you'd be far better with her on camera than me. So.
All right. So with that said, so Greg, you said you've been doing some research. You went to New Orleans?
I just got back from New Orleans. Got back late Sunday night.
And how was that?
Amazing city, great food. And in terms of racism, interesting racial balance that I found.
Balance?
Well, I was thinking about it last night. I met virtually all the Uber drivers who were black, and they sort of talked at great length, but one of them was going on about politics and told me there was more registered Democrats in Louisiana than Republicans, which I found interesting because it's very much a red state.
Okay.
But I was my wife is Inuit, and last night we were sitting and talking about New Orleans, and I said, she asked me about racial tension. And I said, I didn't pick up a vibe of any racial tension. But then again, I got to thinking about it. Well, people are just used to living with each other.
Right.
So there may be racial inequities, and I presume there are. Right. But, just because I was there doesn't mean anything had changed. People have lived next door to each other for 300-400 years now,
Yeah, and it's interesting how you say that, because you say racial tensions. I went to Halifax, as you know, and when you talk about racial tension, it's kind of clandestine or clandestine, however you want to say that word, and sometimes you don't see it. It's not something you can readily pick up on, right? So while there might not seem like there's racial tension, sometimes there is. You just don't know. We just have to kind of move around. And I tell the story of the cab driver not wanting to go to North Preston. And that's a little bit of a racial tension, because North Preston is mostly black and people just didn't want to go there just to pick. Like, you call it Uber, they're not going to come pick you up. And they're not going to, if you're in the Uber, you're going there, then they might take you halfway. That's
I also
tough.
think a white person is a poor person to ask about racial tension. My wife and I lived in Ottawa. I mentioned she's Inuit. And she found Ottawa to be a very racist town. Now, I found French and English problems, but I certainly didn't feel at any point any racial tension.
And Greg, sorry, not to cut you, but that is so interesting. I was speaking to a white person 2 days ago, and he said to me that he's never experienced racism. And I'm like, and he's 31 years old, right? So that's kind of what we're going to touch on today. So just so you know, we already let it out. We're going to talk about racism. We're not experts, as Greg said. We're just going to talk about our personal experiences, right? And what's better than talking about what you've been through and how you see it, right? So you tell us what you think at the end of this video. You can leave a comment in the comment section if you disagree, if you agree, if you're cheering for us, hey, go, then do all of that in the comment section, okay? So the first question I have, Greg, this is not scripted. I just thought of it just now. What, and to girl hand also, what is one of your biggest misconceptions that you've had growing up as a child into adulthood of another race?
Oh, that
I can start.
that's a difficult question.
I
Please
can
go
start. I
first,
can start.
please.
So my biggest misconception that I had was that all white people were rich. When I was growing up, I thought that because I grew up in Jamaica and you see people come on vacation and you're like, oh. So obviously people are in vacation mode. I'm thinking that's my own interactions with white people. So, that's how every white person is, right? And also I thought that all Indians were super smart, right? And now I'm an adult. I see differently. So those are my two biggest misconceptions.
My biggest misconception was so I came to Canada when I was 5, and I came to Toronto specifically. So I thought Canada looked like Toronto until I worked up north
What's up north?
at a summer camp.
Where?
Somewhere along the 400, way down the 400, around Gravenhurst area. And we had our off day, and we got to, go off campgrounds.
Okay.
And when my friend and I walked into a restaurant, it was a big shock to me. And it wasn't that far away from home, but my misconception was Toronto is what Canada looked like.
So was it the diversity or was it the?
It wasn't diverse at all, but my misconception was Canada was diverse. And
Oh, so the lack of diversity shocked
Yes.
you. Oh, okay. I see.
I'll go with. I am very shocked and very disappointed right now with the rise in anti-Semitism, and I thought that was behind us. I, honest to God, thought that was dealt with.
Right.
And then because of what's going on in Gaza now and the protests and
Right.
I'm a big reader. I'm a big supporter of Indigo books, and and it was spray painted. And I have Jewish friends, I have Muslim friends, but I thought anti-Semitism was a thing of the past, and I'm shocked that it's back, and I'm shocked that it's so prevalent.
Yeah, it's a very, very touchy subject. We've talked about some of that on here. Not going down that road today, but we've talked about some of that, and yeah, it's very difficult. It's a difficult because I get both sides.
Yeah.
I get it.
Oh,
The
I do
anti-Semitism, I don't understand it, but I get the tension, right? And it just it's something that we can't solve, and we're definitely not going to solve it in one conversation.
What I don't get is hating somebody just because of their race or their religion.
Okay.
I don't get that.
Right.
And that is something that I hope over the next 100 years is resolved.
Right.
Because, one of the things that you said when you invited me was we're going to talk about changes I've seen in my lifetime, and I'm
Right.
67. And I hope that over the next 100 years or the next 50
We're actually going to
years,
touch on that.
we will see changes in those directions.
We are going to touch on that, and I'm going to ask you to go a little bit deeper about what you think about that. But, let's just start the question. So, Greg, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Fredericton, New Brunswick. And
Okay.
I'll tell you a great racism story about Fredericton, New Brunswick. Fredericton, New Brunswick is where the first black player, Willie O'Ree,
Okay.
was born, grew up, and
Black player in
in the NHL.
NHL, okay.
The first black hockey player, sorry.
Right, okay.
And there was no mention of that growing up. I learned that in a book. And I grew up playing hockey in Fredericton.
Wow.
And at no point did anybody ever mention Willie O'Ree. I found it in a book. And now you go to Fredericton, there's the Willie O'Ree Arena, there's the Willie O'Ree School. So I'm glad they came late to the party. But honest to God, when I was growing up, you never heard a mention of it. And,
SMH.
that blew me away. Now, one of your questions is, would you say it was a diverse community? God, no. We had one street where the black people lived. It was nicknamed Howe Avenue because most of the blacks in Fredericton last name was Howe. And the first black person I met in Fredericton was in grade 9 because I grew up in a part of Fredericton called Nashwaaksis, which was very much sort of middle class, lower middle class suburbia.
Okay.
But it was 99.9% white with one Chinese family and one South Asian family.
Oh, wow.
And that was it. Now, about a kilometer from where I grew up was an Indian reserve, St. Mary's Indian Reserve.
Okay.
We didn't go to St. Mary's Indian Reserve. It was, you were scared of it. You went nowhere near it. And the first time I was on it was when, after I met my wife, who's Inuit, not First Nations.
Mm-hmm.
But I came back to Fredericton and I drove to the reserve for the first time.
Right.
And I never met a black person in Fredericton until there was a black guy who played for the Fredericton Caps hockey team.
Okay.
Gosman, and his daughter is the opera singer that's here in Toronto.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah, that's his daughter. But anyway, I knew of him because I watched the Caps and because I also listened to CBC Radio, and I knew he was a technician at CBC Radio because he toured CBC Radio.
Right.
But I remember meeting Tony Howe, and this would have been grade 9. What would I have been? 1970, 71, something like that. Mm-hmm. And this was during, the racial movement, after the racial movement of the States and
in the 60s.
All the changes of the 60s,
right.
of which I grew up with. But I grew up with, as a very young person, like the hippies and so forth. And I just thought it was so cool to meet a black guy and wanted to be his friend. But, I didn't end up his friend. I didn't end up his enemy. We just didn't have a lot in common.
But Greg, this begs the question: Why did you think it was cool to be the black guy?
Well, because it was what John Lennon would want. It was, I was getting passed down through, bumpkin Fredericton about what was important in life. And in 1975, I went to the University of New Brunswick, which is in Fredericton. Mm-hmm. And I used to drive to work. I had an old 1961 Volkswagen, didn't even have a gas gauge on it. But I would pass by the women's residence. And the girls, and the women, but, in those days we used the word girls. The young women would stand out in front hitchhiking for a drive up to the university.
Okay.
And there was this one gorgeous black girl, and I would pick her up every morning. And I happened to mention this to my dad. And my dad said, well, people should stick to their own kind. And my dad was a good, decent man who just, in the way he was raised, and he was from PEI, that was just the way they thought. So he was very surprised a number of years later when I brought home an Inuit, partner, which, by the way, they loved, and it worked perfectly. But I'll never forget my dad saying, "People should stick to their own kind."
So what do you think? We're going a little bit off script, but what do you think? The playing devil's advocate here, someone would say, "Okay, your dad said that. Stick with your own kind." Mm-hmm. Now that has a lot of undertones. What would you say to people who would say to you, "You're saying your dad is a perfectly good person, but that's how a bad person starts out." That mentality. What would you say to that person?
Well, I would say we're all products of how we grow up. Mm-hmm. And my dad grew up in the Depression, went to World War II, was in the RCAF, and then married my mother, who he met at Maritime Air Command, who grew up in Nova Scotia, Dartmouth, actually.
Yeah.
And they moved to small town Nova Scotia, Middleton, where he was at Greenwood base, and where TransCanada Airlines was at the time. And I doubt my dad really ever met many black people, because in those days the only black people in the whole Maritimes would have been in Halifax, in Africville,
right?
Even before North Preston,
yeah,
and on Howe Avenue in Fredericton. I can't think of a black area of the Maritimes off the top of my head, other than Halifax, Dartmouth in particular, and Africville, at that stage.
Yeah, well. And this just highlights the point that most of racism is just ignorance. We don't know. And because of the unknown, we just kind of tend to draw our own conclusions, right? And we talked about the misconceptions earlier. Those are also called stereotypes. And this is why you shouldn't use those to draw your conclusions, right? So there, lesson number 1. All right.
I'll give you another memory. My dad, because he worked for Air Canada, we traveled free. And every year or two when I was growing up, we'd go to Barbados.
Okay.
Which, and the first time would have been in 1958 with a 1-year-old. So God bless them for traveling.
Why Barbados though?
Air Canada went to Barbados. You got cheap hotels in those days at Barbados. And, having returned as an adult, Barbados is pretty darn close to perfect.
Yes.
And, but they would always have a black maid, and the black maid would love me and my sister as kids. But I was a big T-Rex fan in the 70s.
Okay.
And I remember walking around singing Born to Boogie, which was a T-Rex song.
Okay.
And my dad stops me and he says, "What are you doing?" And I go, "I'm singing Born to Boogie." He says, "Boogie is a bad word for black people." And I'd never heard that, by the way, before or since. But, I never sang Born to Boogie in Barbados ever again either. True story.
That is hilarious. Okay, the thing is, so we skipped past a couple things, and you said that you, apart from Hull Avenue and all that, you've never really, encountered black people. But was race talked about when you were in school? Did anybody mention race? Was there any issues with?
Look, I'll tell you, New Brunswick was far more about French English than about race. New Brunswick is the only bilingual province in Canada.
Okay.
Did you know that?
Well, I would think Quebec is mostly French.
There was really a hatred. Hatred is a strong word, but I'll stick with it, between the French and the English in New Brunswick.
Right.
And there still is, by the way.
Right.
And, so we were, when talk went to somebody different. Also, I'm Protestant, and my first 3 serious girlfriends were all Catholics. And the first girlfriend, Teresa, her father hated me because I was a prod. He hated me. And, my parents weren't ecstatic she was Catholic, but they could live with it. But, stick to your own kind. But, so, like, religious wars and French-English wars were far bigger than race wars because we didn't have anybody of any other race except for the First Nations, and they were just swept aside, not talked about. I mean, they couldn't even vote until, 1961 or 62
Who couldn't
or something. It was just, First Nations were over there, and we didn't have really any significant population of any other size. So it just wasn't talked about. And like I say, Willie O'Ree, the first black player. Now, Jackie Robinson, whatever hometown Jackie Robinson came from, I'm sure they were proud of him.
Right.
Fredericton was never proud of Willie O'Ree till long after I left there in 1979.
Yeah, and that's typical of what we do. It's typical of what we do. But we'll get into all of that.
Okay.
We'll get into all of that. But Girlhand, you have a question, right?
Yes. So what was your first encounter with what you can now label as racism?
Well, I've had a number. One would be, I left Fredericton, I chased a woman to Calgary, and in those days a lot of maritime, never got me anywhere. But anyway, in those days, a lot of Maritimers moved to Alberta. In 1980, I moved in February 1980. And, I remember drunken Indians in front of the liquor store being one of my first encounters with people of a different race.
Right.
Then I moved to Medicine Hat in summer of 81 to take a job. And what I found amazing there was, first of all, Medicine Hat is very much a white town.
Right.
But it's a cowboy town. And every summer they would have the rodeo. And for 2 weeks there'd be all these First Nations people, we called them Indians in those days, but the First Nations would come to town and be the Indians and the Cowboys versus Indians at the rodeo. And the rest of the year you never saw them. And once I was in our mobile unit, I worked in television, and it broke down just outside the Gleason Indian Reserve. And I remember, and I volunteered, because I was the boss, to stay in the mobile when they went back to Medicine Hat to get a new vehicle. But I'm in the mobile unit at the side of the road, just outside the reserve. And I remember being a little bit nervous about that. But, the best example I can give you, a first encounter with racism, is I moved to Toronto in 84. And 84 to 86, Toronto was pretty darn white as well. And I don't remember any issues of racism that I ran into. And, you know, I just don't remember any significant number of people of another race that I ran into. Italians, Jewish people, and so forth, but I don't consider them of a different race.
Right, I agree.
But, you know, that's who I ran into. But when I left my job in Toronto in 86, I applied at 3 people, the CBC, City TV, and I'd gone up in 1980 to do a documentary in the Arctic on Esso about the good work Esso were doing, which was pure.
Esso, the fuel company.
Yeah, the
gas
fuel company. I should burn in hell for that. But anyway, but I was quite, I fell in love with the Arctic. And the Arctic is a place you either love or you hate.
Right.
And so I applied at the Inuit Broadcasting Corporation. They were looking for a trainer. So I go to Ottawa and I'm interviewed for the job. And they ask me, what do I know about First Nations or Aboriginal people, is what the word was in those days. Mm-hmm. And I said, I knew nothing, but I made it up. I said, oh yeah, I used to do this show with the Micmac people at St. Mary's Indian Reserve. Oh, okay, well, yeah. So they hired me. You know, and so I'm on a plane to Baker Lake, which is in what is now Nunavut. In those days, it was the Northwest Territories. Go to Winnipeg and head north. And I'm on a plane from Winnipeg to Baker Lake, well, to Churchill, and then you change planes and so forth. Anyway, they had told me 2 of my trainees would be on that flight because they were coming back from the Inuit Circumpolar Conference in Kotzebue, Alaska. And it dawned on me, I don't know what an Eskimo looks like. I don't know what an Inuit person looks like. I presume dark hair, brown eyes, but that's it.
Right.
And so I had to wait for them to page me on the airplane, and I was a little bit nervous. And, you know, I get to Baker Lake, and Baker Lake is a population of about maybe 1,200 people in those days, and there might be 15 white people in town. But, you know, you might say, well, you've had some experience with being, you know, the population with the less people.
Right. I'm glad you didn't say minority.
But, yeah, the minority. Yeah. Sorry, the word just wasn't coming to me.
Right.
But no, because I was the last group that went north that was still respected or given the benefit of the doubt because we brought guns, we brought bullets, we brought money, we brought central heating, which if you're in an igloo is a big deal.
Right.
And I was still treated with very welcome open arms by the Inuit people. And nowadays I don't think it's the same. But in those days, you know, and we ended up, my generation and the generation before me, ruined Inuit culture, or certainly really did not do a good job. And I will...
Why did you say that?
Well, that's a different conversation. We can get into that later. But, you know, basically through well-meaning goals that go way back to residential school, you know, we did a number of bad things. And I certainly was part of the group that gave recommendations and training that didn't particularly benefit the local people much.
Right.
You know, people don't know, but in the area the Arctic Baker Lake is in, or my wife is from Igloolik, people didn't come into town until the early 60s. They were they led a nomadic life where they chased the animals. And they only came into town because white people needed a place to find them and to give them their baby checks and so forth, and the missionaries needed a place to convert them. And didn't they do such a good job? But you know, my point being, there was about 15 white people in Baker, of which, you know, maybe 7 or 8 were women, the teachers and the nurses.
Okay.
And I had come from television in Toronto where there were a lot of very good-looking women.
Okay.
The women who were the nurses and teachers at the time in Baker Lake were rather large and not as attractive as the women I was used to in television.
Right.
And, you know, I was 29 and wanted a woman. And Well, you're living
It's
by
okay,
your own.
Greg. It's
and
okay. It's okay.
and it snowed for the first time August 27th, so it's cold. I had my own place and the IBC trainer house with its own honey bucket, but that's another story. So, I started looking at the local ladies, but one of the people who I worked with, his wife explained to me, we like white guys coming to town because they look after the widows and they keep our guys from going after the widows, which I found an interesting welcome. But anyway, every second Saturday night there was a place called Club 64 where they offered liquor, beer from sort of 8 till midnight, beer and dancing.
Right.
And, it was sort of for the white people and select Inuit. And I meet this woman, her name is she's one of the Iago twins, and she's going to McGill. And she's gorgeous. And Baker Lake is not known, I hate to say this, Baker Lake is sort of known in the Arctic as not a home. Pangnirtung is known for gorgeous women. Baker Lake, not so much.
Right.
But anyhow, she's gorgeous, but she wants nothing to do with me. So this is most unfortunate. But I eventually meet this woman named Minnie. And Minnie has got her name because the only white name her mother knew was Minnie Mouse. Anyway.
And this person isn't white.
She was Inuit.
Okay.
And, and her mother was unilingual in Inuktitut, as my wife's mother is.
Right.
Anyway, I meet Minnie, and Minnie is biologically accommodating. And this is very important to me. But Minnie is a widow because the hamlet of Baker Lake had driven over her husband with a honey truck, which is the van that pumps the sewage out of your house, that they're driving around town without any brakes. I am not making any of this up. Now, you think about ways to go. Getting run over by the shit truck has got to be up there in bad ways to go. Anyhow, Minnie is biologically accommodating, and I really like that. Minnie's dead now, but Minnie was very good to me.
I hope you know what Greg is saying.
So, you asked what was my first encounter with
racism.
Another race.
Another race.
There was my first encounter with another race.
Well, it's and what we want to piggyback with that question is racism. The first encounter that you've had, I know you talked about your dad saying, stay with your own kind or whatever, but I don't know if you consider that racism. It is, but I don't know if you consider that. Is there another experience that you had?
Well, I certainly consider it in racism. I did at the time, actually, and thought, Dad, you're not very hip.
Right.
John Lennon would not approve.
By the way, Greg's favorite band is the Beatles. So the reference is to John Legend.
I'm a
John
huge
Lennon.
Beatle fan, but to put things in perspective, when John married Yoko, most of the white world was very upset with John because in those days, it's like the Sidney Poitier movie. You didn't have mixed race marriages.
Right.
And, John Lennon really lost a lot of fans when he went with Yoko. And, I have a T-shirt, and I bought it for fun because I have no personal issue with Yoko. But, I have a T-shirt that says, I still blame Yoko. So poor Yoko. But, anyway.
Are you a fan of the Beatles because of how liberal they were?
I'm a fan of the Beatles for two reasons. They changed the world at a time. I watched Ed Sullivan. I was 7 years old. I was blown away. It changed everything. It really changed everything. You had to be alive at that time to know how it changed culture. It changed hair. It changed clothing. It was the generation gap. And it was the baby boomers coming of age. And also, the Beatles, in my opinion, were the only band that got better every album they did.
Right.
Which, when you think about it, is a tremendous accomplishment. And also, I was a John fan, not a Paul fan, because John was smarter, I thought. And John, was brave enough to take on the world, fighting Vietnam, saying, war's over if you want it. I mean, he got silly at times, Yoko in a bag and planting acorns and stuff like that.
Right.
But, at least he used his fame to try to do good. So,
I get it. I get it. All right. So as an adult, is there, have you witnessed? So now we're past the Fredericton. You were past you being in Calgary, and now you're in Toronto, right? Have you ever witnessed anything that you can put a finger on and say that's racism? And were you an alliance in any moment at all?
Most of the racism I have experienced in my life is through my wife,
Right.
who has experienced racism in a way I never ever even knew existed. The way she told me bus drivers in Ottawa treated her different. Now, how would I know that? Because they treated me fine, because I'm white.
Right. Right.
And, I was shocked when she told me she felt Ottawa was so racist. And also, we lived in Quebec, across from Ottawa for 4 or 5 years, and she found that area very racist. But, I'll never forget, we're at a bonfire one night in Quebec, and this woman comes up and goes to Bland. She goes, "Are you Inuit?" And Bland says, "Yeah, are you white?" That story has lived on. And also, then we moved to Toronto in 90. Well, I started working out of here in 97, traveling back and forth to Ottawa, but we moved here permanently in 99. And we're in the taxi one day, and we've got a black taxi driver. And black guy looks at Blandina and says, "You native?" Blandina goes, "Yep." He says, "What kind?" Blandina says, "Inuit." Guy goes, "What's that?" She goes, "Eskimo." He says, "Oh yeah, we learned about those in school." And Blandina goes, "Oh yeah, we learned about black people in school."
Oh, boy.
And I thought that it was fascinating, sort of racism versus racism. And, so most of my experience with racism is through osmosis. I was executive director of the John Howard Society first of all my jobs in Toronto have involved race. From 97 to 2005, I was the executive director of NAMI-Res, which is the Native Men's Residence.
Mm-hmm.
And I'll never forget, it was a Native residence that all the staff, virtually all the staff, were of First Nations heritage.
Right.
And, the odd guy would come into my office and say, "You're white." And I would, say, "Yeah." And, I also knew this was wrong, that the boss was white and the staff were not. So, that was one of the reasons I planned an exit strategy. But then I was executive director of John Howard, and I started to go in the prisons. And, we used to describe the prisons as black and orange, because who was in the prisons were black people in orange jumpsuits and First Nations people in orange jumpsuits. Right. And I took over a staff that had some diversity, and we grew. We expanded a lot. I don't know, during my tenure, we grew about 500%. So we went from maybe 10, 15 staff to 50 or whatever. And, I remember at one point having to tell my middle managers, stop hiring white people, because we had to look like the people we were working with in prison. And, if you want any credibility, you look like the people that you're working with. And, the pushback I got from my white middle managers, not so much that they were racist, but it was just so much easier for them to understand the white people they were interviewing, or the resume of a white person.
Familiarity.
And, it was sort of undercover racism. And I'm not accusing any of the people I worked with who did the hiring of being racist, because they're lovely people. But it was sort of the system. And I actually had to say, no more white people. And it was as simple as that.
Stick a pin, Greg. Let's go back to something that you said earlier. Very interesting to me. You said that you knew it was wrong for the boss to be white in NAMI-Res when everybody else isn't. Why do you think that's wrong?
Well, I mean, I think, now, in Nunavut, I was a trainer.
Right.
I did think that the people that ran Inuit broadcasting should have been Inuit. And certainly these days, the people in charge who are running Inuit media are Inuit.
Right.
And I think that's very important. I do think that if you're a black organization, you should have a black boss.
Right.
I think if you're a First Nations organization, you should have a First Nations boss. If the people you are serving are largely of one race, you should reflect that race.
Right, I agree. But the question, so why do you think it's wrong though? Because based on my observation in Toronto currently, that's kind of what's happening. You have a lot of situations where you have the people who are high up, directors, executive directors, are white people. And you said it's wrong, and I'm just curious as to why that word, because I might agree with you, but I don't know if we're going to have the same disagreement.
Okay,
or agreement.
I say it's wrong, but it's also understandable to some extent. Let me explain to you why.
Okay.
Is Canada has changed over the last 20, 30 years, diversity-wise.
Right.
And I think that's a good thing.
Right.
But you can't fire existing executive directors because they were hired when Toronto was largely white, and now their client base is not white.
Okay.
You can't, that's not fair. I'm a big believer that there should be some turnover with executive directors, but you can't just take somebody's livelihood away from them because they made the mistake of looking like Toronto did in 1985 or whatever, or 1995 even. So, it will happen over time, of course, through osmosis, but, there's the reason, you say there's a lot of agencies that serve a largely diverse base that have a white executive director or white senior management. That's why. And, you can't just fire these people. They deserve to get to retirement and their pension as well. So, there is a natural reason why this happens, as frustrating as that might be.
Right. And I agree, but I think that's one reason. I think there's also institutional racism. I think there's a way in which the system itself creates that dynamic, right? And
I'm not going to argue any of that. I think, and silly me if I did. I do believe there is institutional racism.
Right.
I think any politician that says otherwise is full of shit.
Right.
When I heard that, what was her name? The one from North Carolina who was running against Trump say there was no racism in the States. I thought, geez, I'll take what she's smoking. And Polinarev goes on about how there's no racism. There's a lot of racism in Canada.
There is.
And, people also forget that you get outside Toronto or Montreal or Vancouver, that's not the same country. Right. I guarantee you they think different in Sudbury or Fredericton or Medicine Hat or Moose Jaw than they do in Scarborough.
They do. I lived in Saskatoon for a while, so I could tell you.
Everyone thought you were a football player. I love that.
Everyone thought I was, because there was a Saskatchewan Roughriders, and at the time there was a Saskatchewan Hawks that was playing in the CBA, the North American Basketball League, right? And Saskatchewan just so happened to have a team, and I'm tall, so everybody thought I was a Hawk, right? And people might think that's a good thing, but it's not. It's really not, because I'm not a Hawk. I was just a student studying, right? And I don't want to be classified as just one thing, right? And that's what happened. And
which I found fascinating when you told me, because I also thought about it from, and I'm not from Saskatchewan, but Saskatchewan and New Brunswick are both sort of provinces nobody cares about. And, I thought, well, Saskatchewan's like New Brunswick. There just aren't many black people.
Yeah.
And so if you see a black person, your first thought is he's from away.
Right.
And if he's from away and looks like you do, well, being an athlete would come to mind.
Yeah. Yeah, but then, it's tough, because if you're putting me in a box that I don't want to be in.
Well, no, I get your side of it, and I never, ever even thought of that. You mentioned we had that conversation.
And also, too, what I experienced in Saskatchewan was a lot of what they call microaggressions. And I'll give you an example. So one day I'm going to the gym to play basketball, talking about athletics.
Not professionally.
And this white gentleman was walking towards me with his daughter. His daughter was on my side. when he got closer to me, he switched his daughter to the side towards the wall, right? And immediately it dawned on me. As a matter of fact, I'm lying. It didn't dawn on me immediately. It was afterwards, maybe years after I was thinking about it. I was like, I don't know why I was thinking about it, but I was thinking about it. I'm like, why did he switch his daughter when he was walking close to me? Now, people could say, well, you don't have enough space, but why did you switch your daughter? Like, even if you don't have enough space and I'm scooting over to give her space, that's fine. But the conclusion that came to my head was that maybe it's just the unconscious safety reasons. Like, okay, my daughter is closer to this black man, I'm going to switch to the next side.
Well, I think you summed that up pretty good, yeah.
Right, and those are things that you might not. That happens every day, and people might not think about it. Like a white lady, she's leaving her car, and when she sees me, she's doing an extra chirp, 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 because and she's not thinking directly about me, but it's just a situation that presented itself to her. And those are microaggressions, and I faced a lot of that when I was in Saskatoon, and I didn't know it.
I think you face it in Toronto.
Yes, I was about to say.
I do, 100%.
And it's something I don't know because it doesn't happen to me.
Right.
So I find it fascinating and interesting that this happens, and I'm not surprised.
Yeah, and it's sad. It's sad. But Greg, how do we combat this? And I know that's a big question.
Well, first of all, you don't put me in charge of it. But,
No. I'm not putting you in charge. I just want to hear your perspective.
I truly believe that, and it's a double-edged sword. And I'm a little bit reluctant to open this door, but I'll throw caution to the wind. I think, first of all, the more we have mixed-race marriages, mixed-race children, the more we start to look like each other, the more we all end up brown, the better off we'll all be. And I think, some of that will naturally happen over the next 100 years. You just have to look at the tremendous number of mixed-race children or mixed-race couples these days. And I think that's a good thing. Now, the other side of that knife or that coin, and I learned this in the First Nations world, is, and my daughter, who died last year,
my condolences, by the way.
No, worst thing ever. Was 100% pure Inuit. Okay. Because I married my wife, but Sheena was 100% Inuit. And it was so funny. We got our DNA done. Ancestry DNA was the most boring DNA ever. But anyway, and when we moved to Toronto, if she had had a child, she probably would not have had a pure Inuit child.
Right.
Just because there's very few Inuit in Toronto.
Right.
So, that would have been the end of one strain of the Inuit race.
Right.
And, one thing, I'll never forget reading in a First Nations magazine, encouraging First Nations people to marry among their own to keep their, not so much culture, but their race alive.
Right.
And, so I'm sure that I know that there's a feeling like this in the black community, because one of the things, one of the joys or excruciating moments of my life is I've gone to a lot of conventions, committees, workshops, whatever. And, I remember going to a bunch where they were talking about the black schools, the establishment of black schools. This would be before they had them. Mm-hmm. And, how people were very strong about keeping the race alive. So I know that in the black community, it's a conversation piece as well.
Right.
To keep purity of race. I mean, it sounds very Hitlerian, doesn't it?
Right. Not purity of race per se, but culture strong. So one of the things...
I would actually argue that culture strong, definitely.
Right.
But, the marrying among your own race is a purity of race thing as well, not just culture.
No, 100%. But what the focus is okay. So it's a reaction to what's going on. So what happens is that the African cultural retention, it's been dying out. It's been going extinct. For example, kids in Toronto for the longest time, and you said it yourself, and we can extend it to Canada. We're not learning about Black history.
Sure.
And so if
I
you
never
don't
did.
learn about Black history, what's going to happen is you're going to think that Black people didn't do anything good, right? And so to preserve that, they're saying, you know what, we have to do this. So it's more about that mentality rather than the race itself.
And,
It's
and
just
I think that's very positive, because I think
Right.
growing up, my whole history of the black race was slavery and
Right.
Martin Luther King.
Right.
That was sort of summed it up.
Right.
And later as I went to university in New Brunswick, which is not, the most, University of New Brunswick in those days did not have, African heritage courses or whatever.
Right.
We learned about Jim Crow laws and that sort of thing. So, primarily I learned about American racism.
Right.
And then, as I grew older, I certainly learned about racism against our First Nations and Indigenous folks.
Right.
And I'm very, very glad that these things are being addressed.
Yeah.
And the reason I agreed to do this is in my life, I have seen those changes.
Right.
I have seen inter-race marriages being acceptable. I have seen the change in wanting to teach about Black history. I've seen
Right.
Black History Month. I've
Right.
seen, when I grew up, you beat up gay people.
Right.
In Fredericton, I've
Right.
seen, the legalization of gay marriage.
Right.
We've come a long way in the last 50 years. I'm 67 years of age. And people seem to think nothing happened. And you read all this negative stuff about the baby boom and generation and da-da-da-da. Look, every generation blames the generation before.
Right.
But, my generation was the first to have the ecology sign. We were the first to bring up, we had Ralph Nader, we had pollution.
Right.
We addressed air pollution, water pollution. We started to address racism in my lifetime. Certainly, I was alive before Martin Luther King did his walk.
Right.
So that happened in my lifetime. Certainly, the changes in gay marriage and so forth happened in my lifetime.
Right.
We have come a long way. And people seem to forget that. And, I don't know how that, take a smarter man than me, but I don't, and we've also seen feminism, Me Too movement. I can remember I had a boss who had a full bar in his office. You wouldn't do that anymore. It used to be okay to sleep with the women you worked with.
Right.
That was part of what happened,
Right.
especially in television in those days.
Right.
And, that stuff is not happening anymore. This,
Right.
It used to be okay. I mean, we used to joke growing up in New Brunswick that drunk driving, well, of course you drove because you were too drunk to walk. And that is not acceptable anymore. And I'm hoping, and it's starting to happen, that in my lifetime, or certainly in your lifetime, that domestic abuse is not acceptable anymore.
Right.
That we just do not accept it. There's no excuses and there's no forgiveness. So how that translates into racism over the next 50 years, like I say, take a smarter person than me to figure out. But if all that can be accomplished in my lifetime, there's no reason to think it won't happen. There will be improvements. And it's not a straight linear line. There's ups and downs. I mean,
Right.
Trump has made saying shit okay again. He changed North America, I would argue, the world. He let it be okay to be racist, okay.
Again.
Again.
Right.
And, the trucker movement in Ottawa, I don't believe would have happened without Trump. And now people think vaccinations are bad.
Right.
And, and now, wow, all of a sudden measles are back. And polio, for heaven's sake. I mean, how big an idiot does it take to, do this? And that I worry about. Having said that, it comes in cycles. It goes up and down, but it goes up ultimately.
But that begs
as
the
long as we
question.
don't nuke each other.
Yeah, that begs the question. With all you said, Greg, and you're 100% right. I agree with most of what you said. With all you said, it begs the question. So we've gone from one extreme, and now it seems like we're going to another extreme, and that's causing people now to divert, to go back to what they know.
But the
and do you think
pendulum
that's a bad
swings, you
thing?
know?
Because it seems like it's a bad thing. It seems like because we are now legalizing gay marriages, because we are now having to watch what we say and how we say it, because of the things where, for example, you're at work, you can't be in a relationship because the person might accuse you of doing this and doing that. So people have to watch what they're doing. And, that's called the Me Too movement. Because of all these things, what's happening now is that everybody's saying, you know what? We have to be politically correct.
Yep.
So
Woke.
that PC movement has gained crazy traction because of how we're the direction we're going in. Do you think that's a good thing?
Well, I think, first of all, it's human nature to correct anything.
Okay.
So, we went from unwoke to too woke, and we'll correct. And I think it's already starting to correct because of what happened in Gaza. And, those university presidents who got fired down in the States because they wouldn't say anti-Semitism is bad.
Right.
Can you imagine not having the guts to say anti-Semitism is bad?
Right.
It's like anti-Palestinian is bad. Anybody, just because of their race, religion, creed, or whatever, is bad. And you've got to be able to say that. So maybe it's starting to autocorrect.
Right.
I don't know.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Girlhand, you have anything specific you want to add? So it's a tough one, Greg. It's a tough one. We've gotten to a point where I was thinking about this topic before we did it, and for me it was just there's so much to unpack that, and this is why we took this approach. The approach that we're taking here is about our personal experiences. We didn't go into the scientific, the sociological, the psychological, because there's so much and we're not experts, right?
Yep.
And I think one of the most important things to take from this is to understand that each one can teach one. So if you take your personal experiences and you do the best you can, then at the end of the day, we might see some change. Because believe me, don't underestimate how much impact you have as a person. Because one person, and Jordan Peterson always says this, one person might know 1,000 people. You might not know them very well, but you have 1,000 people that are your contact. And that leaves you 2 people away from 1 million. Because if those 1,000 people know 1,000 people, add it up and you'll see. So you can have an impact. So we're trying to make sure that we work out the kinks in our personal lives, in our mentality, our thoughts, before we try to change the world. And believe me, if you try to do that, then we might make a difference.
I agree. And just building on what you say, the last 2 jobs I've had have been with virtually a non-white staff.
Right.
Where the vast majority of people I'm working with are of a different race than me.
Right.
And that has been a tremendous educational experience and exposure to me.
Right.
And I have learned a lot. When I was at John Howard, our accountant was from Jamaica, and she would come in every week with a radically different haircut. And I thought, wow, she was using good hairstylists, because one week it would be short and one week it would be long.
Right.
And I had no idea about wigs or extensions at all. I mean, I had no frame of reference. And it took the Chris Rock documentary about black women's hair for me to learn this. And, by talking to so many of my coworkers and becoming really good friends with one of my co-managers who's black. Mm-hmm. We have a beer and I'm able to ask questions.
Right.
And he doesn't get offended at my questions because they are based in knowledge I want to learn.
Right.
Because I didn't know this. And, it's also like you saying people in Saskatchewan thought I was a football player.
Right.
It would never dawn on me that sort of thing happened, or that somebody would move their child away from you when you're walking.
Right.
Because that's so out of the norm for me.
Right.
But, the more we talk with each other and learn, and what I worry about with Trump and with the Conservative Party, to be honest, is there's no interest in learning.
Right. And that's a problem.
That's a problem. And I think the most important thing we can do as human beings is learn. And
right.
Anyway.
I think people have made their conclusions. I think I've been on job interviews before, and just by me speaking and the way I speak, I could tell that they've made their conclusion. Because this is also a fact. Whenever you have an accent, in being in a particular country or group, people think that you're less intelligent. It's just a fact. It's just how people think. They don't take the time out to listen to what you're saying, which is what. So when I moved to Saskatoon, one of the things I hated was before I started talking, people would say, "Oh, what did you say?" And I'm like, I didn't even say anything yet. I hated that. So I tried my best to speak so that people can understand. Even then, people still said, "Oh," because they're expecting me to have an accent because I was different, right? And that's an issue. If we don't get over that issue, then we're never going to give people an opportunity. Now we go back to the jobs in Toronto, and that's one of the things too. A lot of people of color are not in high places, so to speak, because it's just maybe you're not considered that you could do the job, right? And the Conservatives, they have a huge problem with that. Trudeau, what he did was, they call it equality of outcome, where he kind of handpicked, okay, I want my defense minister to be this, I want this to be that. And Conservatives are saying, what are you doing? The best person should be able to do the job, right? And that's equality of opportunity. So they do the equality of outcome, equality of opportunity debate all the time, and that causes issues because on one side they have a point. You can't just cherry pick people to do a job because you need someone who can do the job. But at the same time, if you don't have people who are of bringing some kind of diversity, especially in a country like Canada who celebrates multiculturalism, then you're going to have an issue. So how do we solve this problem?
Well, I mean, time is how you solve it. I mean, I'll go back to Nunavut. Nunavut is 85% Inuit, which means 85% of the jobs should be Inuit, right? Well, you can't make somebody an air traffic controller just because of their race.
Right.
You can't make somebody a doctor or a surgeon just because of their race.
Right.
So this sort of takes time
Right.
to have, first of all, the home life that encourages that education, that eventually, those jobs do belong to Inuit.
Yes.
But I had a thought here the other day. Where I work right now, where you work as well,
Right.
we are hiring people named Blessing, named Innocent Ron.
Right.
These are not white names.
Right.
But these are new Canadians that have come to us from Africa.
Right.
And you know what? They come, we hire them. They're at the bottom of the pecking order. These are
Right.
the entry-level jobs.
Right.
But they get a couple years under their belt, and then they go somewhere like the city of Toronto or Fred Victor or something, make more money, get a pension,
Right.
have children, become Raptor and Maple Leaf fans,
Right.
and become Canadians.
Right.
And, just like my ancestors did, the French ancestors did, the Italians, the Jews, the Portuguese, each wave, the people from Hong Kong, the people from China, the waves of people that came here get absorbed into Canada.
Right.
And I think that's a lovely, wonderful thing. I wish more moved to New Brunswick or Saskatchewan. But, you do see the ads in the subway, move to Saskatchewan.
Right.
And, over time, many good things will happen.
Right.
Now, will they happen if somebody's not jumping up and down saying make them happen? Of course not.
Right.
So, squeaky wheel is important.
Yeah.
Anyway.
It's not. Yeah. It's not gonna. I think it has to be a deliberate thing, right? Homeostasis will not take place here, right? It will not go back to its mean. It's not gonna happen. We just have to consciously see this conversation. as simple as you might take this conversation is important, because what we're going to be doing, we're going to be putting this conversation on YouTube, and people will watch it, right? And
I'm sorry for anything I said that offended anybody.
No, you haven't been offensive. You spoke your mind, you spoke your piece, you spoke your experience, and that's exactly what I wanted. And I thank you for it. Thank you for doing this. Thank you very much. And again, the way we're going to solve this is by understanding each other. The more you don't know is the more stupid things you're going to do. Trust me. The more you know is the more informed you are. So now, if you know something and you still do the bad thing, then we know what kind of person you are. But if you don't know and you're doing it, we can't really tell, because you didn't know in the first place. So the information puts you in formation. Think about that for a second.
If I could add two things too. Travel your country. Learn Canada, including the Arctic, including the Maritimes, including the prairies, and also travel the world.
Right.
Learn about different cultures. Go a place where people speak a different language than you.
Right.
The more we learn from steal ideas, bring them back.
Right.
My wife, my daughter, and my sister-in-law and I went to China, Mongolia, and then took the Trans-Siberian train across Russia.
Okay.
And I can tell you that we didn't run into very many people that spoke English at all, and in Mongolia, like 3.
Right.
And you learn the goodness of people
Right.
when you can't communicate.
Right.
And, I remember people helping me in all 3 of those places, those countries, just by the goodness of people. And I don't think people are naturally mean, and I don't think people are naturally bad. I think people are naturally reluctant to change.
Right.
But I think travel, learn both your country and the world, and he or she who dies having learned the most wins.
Right. I hope you're right. You wanted to say something? Go ahead.
And I wanted to just add that I think a part of the change is to have the uncomfortable conversations.
Right.
Because it's very interesting that Craig said that he never experienced racism himself. Mm-hmm. However, him hearing you speak about your experiences, it opens up his eyes to, this is a form of racism, or this is how somebody else of a different race can be impacted by racism. So yep. I think forcing those uncomfortable conversations rather than shying away from it is what broadens the scope.
I think that's well said. And before we go, 2 more minutes, Greg. We're going to do some quick questions.
Sure.
I know Beatles are your favorite band, but what's your favorite music by a non-white artist?
I love Zydeco, and I was just down in Louisiana. I'm a big Zydeco fan. I certainly like rhythm and blues, reggae, early rock and roll. These are all black music, or a combination of black music and music that came out of the Appalachian Hills or whatever. Okay. So I love all those types of music.
That's really good. And tell me your favorite cultural meal and your least favorite cultural meal.
Well, I'm lucky. I've had cultural meals from all around the world. I'll tell you a funny cultural meal story. First time my wife takes me to her hometown of Igloolik. I'm living in Iqaluit, which is the capital of Nunavut, but it's at the south part of Baffin Island, and Igloolik's up at the north part. So I'm going home, and I'm a white guy, and I want her family to like me. So I get off the plane, meet her mother and father. They don't speak a word of English. Great in-laws. We never had a problem. But they say, go across the road and see Granny. Well, Granny's on the floor in her kitchen, and she's hacking at some raw meat. And I'd had raw caribou, and I'd had raw char and raw seal, living in Baker, and living with Blandina. And, Granny waves a piece of raw meat at me. And I took a bite of it, and I thought I was going to die. This was the worst tasting shit I'd ever had in my life. It was Igunok, fermented walrus meat.
Oh my God.
Because every culture invents a way to get stoned. And it turns out that Inuit would take a walrus, bury it under the ground, say, 6 months later, it's good to eat now. Oh. And this green, rotting flesh. And I took a bite, and I thought I was going to die. But, I wanted Granny to like me, so I smiled. Well, the old doll gives me another piece. I didn't smile so big. So that was, certainly my biggest memory of a different culture's meal.
Okay, all right, thank you. Oh, and I guess your favorite sport is baseball, because you said you have a baseball.
I'm a big baseball fan. I'm a hockey fan.
You're a hockey fan.
And I'm a
Okay.
soccer fan.
All right, so the first word that comes to mind when you hear fashion.
When I hear what?
Fashion.
Fashion?
Yes.
Dedicated follower of fashion by the Kinks. Bell-bottom pants. I don't know.
What's your favorite hobby?
My favorite hobby, I love to read, I love to garden, I love to travel.
Okay. And the last one, most desired non-white person you would like to meet, dead or alive.
Well, I saw that question up there, and I'd like to give an astounding, wise answer. I'd like to say Gandhi or Martin Luther King.
You can say whatever.
You know who came to mind was Jesus. And I'm not a religious person, but I'd like to have met Jesus. And I don't believe Jesus was white. I'd like to have met Cleopatra, and I don't believe Cleopatra was white.
No.
But, I'd like to have met Tina Turner. Tina Turner is great fun, and
Yeah.
I'll bet you she'd be a hoot.
Greg, thank you. This was delightful. Thank you guys for watching. This was another episode of Deep.Organic.Phuckery, and please like, share, comment, subscribe. Help us, help the channel, help us grow. If you like her content, help us grow, and we will provide more content for you. So with that said, racism then and now, we are out.